Over the whole course of the war, there were about 17,000 professional nurses belonging to the Queen Alexandra's Imperial Military Nursing Service or to the Territorial Force Nursing Service. There were about 17,000. But we believe, it's not clear what the exact numbers were, but we believe there were 74,000 VAD nurses. Those were the British volunteer nurses. So if you think of the difference between the 17,000 and the 70-odd thousand, there were really huge numbers of VADs. And most of them worked on the home front in Britain, but some of them worked overseas in the base hospitals in northern France. VADs were a very interesting feature of the British nursing landscape, but they didn't exist in that form anywhere else. And they'd first been introduced in Britain in 1909 during a series of reforms that we call the Haldane reforms, when Britain was very aware that a war was probably looming on the horizon. There was likely to be war, and they were getting themselves into a state of readiness for warfare. And one of the things they did was establish a territorial army. And the idea was that that army would defend Britain if there was an invasion or an attempted invasion. In the event, that army had to go across into France and into different fronts during the war. It wasn't possible for it to just stay at home, it was needed. And the same thing happened in nursing. So Britain had a Queen Alexandra's Imperial Military Nursing Service. It had a professional army nursing service that was very small. But people realised that those nurses wouldn't be sufficient. Even if the war was quick and over by Christmas, there wouldn't be a sufficient number of nurses. So they established a system called the Voluntary Aid Detachments, VADs, and that name, VADs, just became stuck to the nurses. In fact, in voluntary aid detachments, those were whole units of workers, of hospital workers. So they were nurses, ambulance drivers, cooks, orderlies, everyone that was needed to set up a small hospital unit. But it was the nurses, the volunteer nurses in those units who got the title VAD, and it just stuck to them. And VADs are a legend in Britain. You know, they've been seen as the real nurses. And as I've said before, they could never really have done that real nursing work if they hadn't had the supervision of the professionals. But they did have quite a serious training. They had usually 6 months apprenticeship training in a general hospital, a civilian hospital. So they would have worked as a nurse for 6 months under the supervision of trained nurses. And they also had to complete 4 certificates of training in bandaging and first aid, in sick nursing, so that's the fundamental nursing work, in sick cookery, and in the management of the sick room. So actually, that training was given to them by professional nurses. So they did have, they'd done a lot of, they'd listened to lectures, they'd done a lot of training work, and they had had to pass certificates before they could be seen as a qualified VAD nurse. So there was probably more to it than we often realise. You know, it wasn't just that they rushed forward at the last minute and became VADs and just worked as nurses. They did have quite a significant training that had been offered to them by the professional nurses. VADs were only ever intended to nurse the wounded back at home in Britain. So it was anticipated that there might be a war in France, you know, there might be a war front in that region. But the idea was that patients would be brought back across the Channel to Britain on hospital ships, and then they would be put into base hospitals in Britain, and they'd be nursed partly by, well, mainly by VADs with just a few trained nurses. But what happened was that the need was just so great in France and Belgium on the Western Front that a decision was taken in the spring of 1915 to allow VADs to work in military hospitals, including military hospitals overseas. So from about March or April onwards, VADs were actually posted to base hospitals, military hospitals in France. They were never put in the very forward hospitals for the British, the casualty clearing stations, but there were a lot of them, thousands of them, in the base hospitals in France.